And we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to In the Arena, my first edition of In the Arena, where we talk with the builders shaping the future of AI and crypto. I'm Carson Farmer, CTO of Recall, and today I'm joined by Matt Wright, who is the CEO of GaiaNet. Gaia is a decentralized AI network that lets anyone run and share models across the community or across community-operated nodes, from servers to mobile devices, which we're definitely going to talk about. So we're going to dig into how Gaia is rebuilding AI infrastructure around decentralization, privacy, user sovereignty, all that cool stuff, including hopefully a little bit about their new phone bringing inference to the edge. So welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
How's it going over there?
It's going good. It is rainy in New York, but things are going great, regardless of the shenanigans we saw on crypto Twitter this weekend.
Yeah, it's a wild. We can talk about that a little bit too. It's a bit of a wild ride. Markets are responding today, and yeah, crazy space. It's kind of an interesting time to be observing everything because you're like, wow, what are people going to do with this? Anyway.
It's a crazy world right now. We've got, of course, crypto markets, traditional markets that are very focused on AI, and people are wondering if it's a bubble in both kind of Web 2 AI and in Web 3 AI. But I think I'm very excited about a lot of things, especially what's going on in open source, what we're doing at Gaia. So happy to kind of dive in.
Yeah, sweet. Okay, well, let's just start there. Let's just pretend this chaos and carnage isn't happening. And so for people new to Gaia, let's start there. How would you describe what you're building in kind of simplest terms?
Yeah, we're building a decentralized AI inference protocol and network. And so what that means is we're enabling folks to take open source large language models. These are smaller large language models, but you can take your own data, whether it's natural language, code, numerical data, and turn that into inference that you can serve via API. And your customers could be AI agents, it could be applications. And so we have a lot of agents right now that are using OpenAI API on the back end under the hood for a lot of their inferences, and they're paying a nominal monthly subscription fee and passing their data over to these megalords of inference and of AI. Whereas they could be doing this on their own. They could be having a more sovereign control of their data, how this inference is being used between compute, data, and models. You can actually unlock yourself from those economics of an OpenAI or other larger AI providers, where you can kind of set the terms with your customers on them consuming your APIs versus you consuming OpenAIs. So we're trying to help developers, agents, institutions, creators leverage open source large language models, monetize their own data.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. And I mean, you started to allude to it, but I think this is an important piece, right? Which is like, why, you mentioned these monoliths and these, and like, I'm on board because I don't really think that the future of our like most, broad strokes, accessible intelligence machine should be controlled by a few. But like, why is decentralizing inference so important in general? And then maybe like right now, because I think we are at an inflection point right now where we do have to get pretty serious in the short term about how we move forward with this like amazing piece of technology, and so why, from a maybe like philosophical stance. But then on top of that, there's like some real technical and like innovation reasons as well, right? So like, what can't centralized AI clouds do that, say, a decentralized AI cloud could?
Yeah, so I'll start on the kind of scary reality we're facing. If you look at it from an individual end user perspective of what we already use on a daily basis with like ChatGPT and Claude and all these applications, I'm also a user. I think they're great. I have so much fun with like this weekend I was playing around with Sora. My wife's like cracking up at all my videos. Like it's great. All these tools are amazing. We live in a very interesting time. However, if I'm putting my likeness, whether it's now like video, my voice, whether it's natural language, like if it's my social media history, my writing, I'm using ChatGPT to a capacity where I'm putting in PDFs, spreadsheets, different documents, my opinions. Like, I'm using it as a counterpart to, really think how I'm thinking. And so these technologies are really starting to understand us to a very deep level, and we're giving all of our data to these providers. Now, if we're doing that, there's a lot of issues of censorship, of what can I get out of this prompting, and that decision making is made by a small group of people. There's also the issue of economics. The models right now are like business models are kind of trapping us inside of these systems where we're paying and we're renting kind of our time inside of these platforms. But really, like, the data we put into them is no longer our data. We're basically forfeiting our data to kind of these platforms. Lastly, there's not a lot of ways for you to manage how you want to handle the efficiency of that system. There's not a lot of modularity of how you're using compute, how you're using data, how you're using which models. You can drag and drop models, but they're handling the inference for you, and they make it very easy. But now imagine all this from the perspective of a business, or a country, or an institution, NGO or a government agency. It's really difficult for them to subscribe to the rules of somebody else, not to mention not have any custody or governance over their own data. Not to mention, if they stop paying the tab, this institution might be like, well, you can't get your data out of here. This is ours now. It's kind of like, these are doomsday scenarios. Like, do I think that these institutions will do that today? Like, I don't know, but it's on the table. Like, who knows what they end up doing? And it's the same business model of Web 2. If we look at what Web 2 did, like with the large social media companies, in kind of Web 2 days, we didn't realize we're giving over so much data, and then they turn around and made us the product by charging advertising and really revolutionizing a new business model on the internet. But we didn't subscribe to a lot of that, and people were shocked when they really shouldn't have been. I think what's going to happen in AI is going to be a lot worse. I think we're going to realize it a little too late that we are the product once again, and it's going to be to the factor of you are getting advertised to within your chats and you don't know it. It's going to be to the factor of you having to pay for access to your own data, and it might even be something as scary as create me a dashboard of news, of content, of my workflow, and angle it in a way that works for my tastes, my likeness, like things I enjoy. And I think that's going to bring humanity into more and more silos, which is going to make us much more vulnerable to political preferences, to the way we, to consumer behavior, like to basically like our attention and how we live our life is going to be at the expense of the top payer, like the top, purchaser of that advertisement. And so there's some interesting business models that are unfolding that, if we do not build more sovereign systems, it is quite scary. To answer your second question on like, well, what do we have to look forward to? Why open source, and why are we using more of open protocols? I don't think that there's going to be, the way the internet's always worked is you always have options. There's not going to be like one or the other. I think I will always use some form of a centralized AI model. I'm not one of those guys that live off the grid and have a shack with tinfoil on the walls. But like, a lot of these larger models will perhaps be mentors or guides to these smaller models that are perhaps more privacy preserving, more open source, more kind of permission to accessing my private data, and enables me to permission what the larger model can get access to. So I think there'll be different ways that these models play with each other in the future. But I think the bare metrics that we're seeing right now is, last August we had 400,000 open source models in Hugging Face. Today we have 2 million plus. We have the cost of inference has been halving every 4 months. So since last year, we've had 10x plus more efficiency in inference. And so it's getting really close to a world where it becomes very plausible or accessible for anyone to have their own model, multiple models, run their own models, train their own models easily. There's all these different tools today where you can vectorize your data, or turn it into a machine readable file that is, to your likeness or to the data that you provide it. And so I think it's just becoming a lot more of this open, composable AI internet or agentic internet where you don't have to, just consume this AGI model, the single AGI model. We think there's much more modular future.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's a sort of exciting future that I personally want to live in. As an open source advocate, that's, like that's the natural path that you kind of want to see happen is this like hyper optimization for very specific use cases and being able to sort of like plug and play and um, so what does that maybe look like on Gaia in practice, right? Like what does actually running models across community run nodes kind of look like? Maybe not at the bare bones, like sort of like bare metal, but like in practice, what does that sort of look like in terms of
Yeah.
participation?
So right now you can go to our GitHub and clone down the repo and run your own like Llama 3B, Mistral, Quen, Kimi K2. OpenAI even has their open source offering. It's like the 20 billion parameter model. You can run this locally on your computer. You can run it in the cloud. So I ran a couple in like an AWS EC2 instance, or some guys are running on Google. You can obviously, like now we're working on some of these smaller models to work on a phone, which we'll talk about in a sec.
Yeah.
Samsung Galaxy S25 Edge. But essentially, you can take these smaller large language models and you can train them with some tools we have, and like we use vectorization tools like LangChain, and we have like a VectorDB to host the RAG, and you can essentially in 5 minutes or less get your node up and running, and it's essentially an AI inference server, and it has its own API server. You can actually just dish that to your apps, and it works.
Is that's
And
a open AI compatible API? Yeah.
compatible. Yeah,
Nice.
then we even did some MC compatibility too, so your node can also talk to MCP or do some MCP tool calling. And so I think what's really cool is, you can take, right now it's taking like, depends how quick you are as a developer, but you can essentially fine tune or build out your knowledge base, like build out the RAG so that your responses are accurate. And so we did do some peer reviewed research where if you take a smaller large language model and train it specifically on some specific information, say like, your own notes, or maybe you have like a bunch of papers that you wrote on a certain thesis. Maybe it's a bunch of DeFi data you're sitting on. You can actually train those models on that specific data, and it actually is more performant than another like the same model that's not trained on that context. So these nodes like do operate. They're not as performant, let's say, as a generalized model that is costing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the likes of OpenAI, and they're not really charging you for that. They're telling you that it just costs 20 or $100 a month. So in this case, you really do become your own inference provider. You are taking on the responsibility of being a business owner. You got to handle your compute, whether that's on-prem or it's on device or it's in cloud. You have to manage the kind of which model you want to use for the certain use case, and you have to manage kind of the data sanitization, or what is it that is going to be the specific nodes utility. And then from there, you can either build multiple nodes that answer specific questions, and your agents can essentially just call those APIs. And there's a piece where Web3 comes in I can explain later, but it's a very quick way for anyone to take their own knowledge base and take an open source model and be able to serve that to their customers. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Are you finding, like I've been playing around with the Kimi models a bit
Mhm.
for code, and it's actually like really impressive. So are you finding any teams are kind of like deploying their own, like fine-tune coding LLM for any of their like actual development and things like that?
We're using Mistral for a lot of the kind of coding use cases. We did build a node for the open source Rust community. So we trained a node on Rust docs and some of the repos, and we actually had it's called Llama Coder, but essentially you could it's, basically like on Cursor IDE, you can pull in your node instead of like using OpenAI,
Yeah.
and it would be the Rust node. And so you can actually have a copilot, coding copilot, who's really just trained on Rust
Yeah. Nice.
versus like more generalized. On the performance of that, like compared to an AGI or not AGI, like a more centralized model. I don't have the math on that for you, but we're doing some cool experiments because we think that it's really cool that in the future, you could have protocols that, are the custodians or the owners of these models or inference setups, and they could be either charging or, somehow subsidizing the cost to their customers or their community. So if like if Uniswap at some point they have all this data, if they wanted to like serve um, they want to serve like their own inference to anyone that holds like a uni LP position, like a tokenized NFT,
Oh, yeah, that's
or
cool.
anyone that holds uni. Like you could basically
Yeah.
subsidize inference to those power users, um, and it could continue to build the knowledge base of like Uniswap versus
Oh,
like
wow.
just giving all that data to OpenAI. That's years away though.
Yeah, but that's a really cool idea. I mean, that's where I guess where the Gaia token can kind of start to fit into some of this as well, which we can dive into in a sec. But that's quite interesting to be able to subsidize inference access to your community
Hmm.
through actual on-chain behavior, and that's actually a really neat idea. I mean, that's something like a team like Recall would be pretty stoked to start to explore. So that's a
Let's
cool
jam.
idea. Yeah, yeah, no, it's for real. That's quite a neat idea. I mean, that's the sort of superpower of having these like inference DePIN style networks is like the token emissions can act as subsidy, and you can actually like compete on cost eventually
I
with these bigger providers in theory.
Yeah, and I had a crazy idea with our chief scientist, which would be like in the near future, we could even have like derivative tokens that represent the AI inference of like a project. Like could have uni token, but you could have like AI uni.
Right,
And like
right. Yeah.
you're like a partial owner of like how they handle their compute and inference and models.
That's
Yeah,
very cool.
future stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much to do here. And I mean, so related to all this, I guess, is presumably you're going to get like a professional class of inference provider who are starting to hyper optimize for very specific use cases and very specific communities. And then when you said, oh, like performance maybe is not on par with the big models yet, but like at some point, performance
It's getting close.
is going to catch up, at least for very specific use cases. And I know in the open source world, like the open code team now they host their own code models that are like hyper optimized for that specific use case, and they're looking at a lot of open source models. So I mean, it would be awesome if that team just started using Gaia or started deploying Gaia nodes, but either way, I imagine this is what's going to start to happen is we're going to have these like professional class providers that are hyper optimized for specific use cases and like actually can perform.
Yeah, we're seeing like more and more, model labs pop up and ways that they can monetize in unique ways. So if they are, offering their free models, but then able to monetize through hosting inference to, white label applications. There's some interesting things there. I think the other consideration is, like I mentioned earlier, like all these, like, there's 2 million open source models now, and that's not even counting how many of them have cloned from the kind of Hugging Face repos and just run the stuff in house, and
Right.
perhaps have forked these several times over. I worked at JP Morgan on Quorum, which is a open source fork of Ethereum. We made Ethereum works for banks, and we had a very similar kind of go to market. That's kind of what attracted me to this project from the beginning, which was kind of this open source go to market strategy. And within the bank and within our partners, like we had so many iterations of Quorum that were being used in private. And the only way we knew really what it was being used for was if we had communications with those teams. And so there's although there's 2 million open source models that are hosted, I think there's millions that are actually, or probably billions of like in terms of like instances that they're being used inside of institutions. Like I just talked to Swift. I just talked to Swift and some other enterprises this week, and like they're all exploring open source. Like they're not going to go give their data in house to a centralized provider. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a massive issue of privacy. That's enterprise's biggest concern.
Right.
And if you think about it, institutions for hundreds of years, like this is at least in terms of the internet too, like even like past 50 years, like this is not a new game for them. This is like when open source Linux and Kafka came into play, like they were using this stuff in house. They were not going straight to the slickest new like software on the block. Like they were using things that help their data be more robust. So open source is catching up in terms of performance, but in terms of data availability and compute availability inside of these enterprises, like they actually have a much bigger advantage than someone like an OpenAI. They can be their own AI providers.
Right. Okay, I just did a quick time check. I'm gonna get to the phone stuff because I think this is pretty cool.
Oh yeah,
So,
cool.
yeah, the phone as node idea, it's extremely fascinating. Obviously, everybody's pretty excited about it. So, how does this kind of all fit into the network?
Yeah, and I'm stoked to be working with you guys on it. So I appreciate you guys being part of it. So we had a really serendipitous opportunity to work with Samsung on, on a Web3 AI phone. The idea was, how do we take large language models, put them on a device, and serendipitously, we had already been experimenting with this. Our chief scientist was he was running smaller large language models on a Raspberry Pi, and we were testing out with other devices, and this deal came along. So the real strategy here and plan is, how do we demonstrate to the community that you can start to run these smaller large language models on different types of interfaces, platforms, devices. We've had people that are, confused how we're able to even do this, but we can. Like we're doing it. We have actual phones we're testing this out with. Is it going to be your kind of open AI application that's just like smooth and slick and they're handling all the inference over cloud? It will get close. I think as these models start to develop, if you need it for like very local on-device prompting and responses that are trained on your notes or trained on the way you use the phone, there's some really cool things we can activate that you can't do with these other apps. Like for example, like with this app, you'll be able to turn off your Wi-Fi and your service, and you can still use it, which I think is in itself pretty
Right.
pretty damn cool. Um, Again, it's going to be trained on your likeness, and you have to provide more data to it for it to do things. And so with projects like Recall and like Intuition, who we're working with, we're able to add more context and more agentic features to the actual application that's on the phone. Um, for example, Intuition is enabling, like they're building an app where every day you can, answer a question and attest to something about yourself. Like I like
Oh,
going
that's
to
cool.
this coffee shop more often, or like here's access to my data on like my like 4 places I went on Google this week. Um, and then so that's going to help feed the training. And then for Recall, giving agents more accessible tasks to do is going to be something really interesting. Imagine if you can just text your Gaia chat app like, "Hey, go move $1,000 in USDC to ETH. Let me know when you're done." We're actually we built in like MCP compatibility on the app, so we'll actually be able to take agent apps on the phone and talk to them seamlessly and in a privacy preserving way. So,
Yeah.
there's some major unlocks, but I think the biggest thing is that we're showing people that you can run a small large language model on device, and these models are continuing to scale. So we'll be able to continue to innovate on the phone.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about the local model stuff and the tool calling is that it turns out they actually, especially if they're fine tuned on tool calling data sets and things, they can do a ton of, like, they can figure out what tools to call and how to call them without a massive model. And then you start plugging in all these extra tools that do the actual work so you can get a lot done. And then the thing I like about that, especially for like on device stuff, is then the tool calls themselves can be gated by permissions. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
my local model wants to do something, and am I super sure that I want to let it do that? Yes, and I can supervise. I like that model a lot. I think it's a smart one on your part to be
Thanks,
exploring
man.
that. You
Yeah.
guys must also be pretty excited about some of the recent like recursive reasoning research that's coming out, where they're getting like pretty impressive results from even smaller, uh, um, not LLMs, I guess, but this is a sort of different brand of model.
Yeah, yeah. And that's kind of our big thesis and bet, is that that's going to continue to be parabolic. We don't see any brake pads on, like, models in open source in some way, shape, or form not becoming more efficient, more cheap to run, for your common day person to just own and grow with. We think that it will be really easy and convenient to work with, like, um, let's say in the future it's like an AGI or centralized AI platform or SaaS that makes it really easy for you to prompt things. But if people aren't willing to give up their data, like, those platforms are going to continue to context wall. And so we think that if you incentivize people to really be the owners of their system, and that models are continuing to be innovative and scale, that this will constantly be an upward trend where people can have more governance.
Nice. Well, I didn't get to anywhere near all the questions that I wanted to ask you, so we're
I
obviously going to
know.
have
I
to
read
wrap
them
up.
all.
We've got, we wanted to talk about so much more, but I think we're at time, and I don't want to steal too much extra of your time, um, unless Brian, you tell me I have a little bit more time. But I think that's it. So I just want to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. It's pretty clear that if sort of decentralized edge-based inference becomes the default, a lot of things are going to change about how we interact with AI and engage with our devices and the external APIs that our devices communicate with, how people trust AI, how they use it. It's kind of all up in the air, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's pretty cool. I guess the question becomes, what kind of world does that unlock, and where, like, you know, intelligence is on the edge. I mean, technically that's where we started, right? The only form of intelligence we really had were people, and we all have it sitting at the edge, and then starting to centralize and hopefully pull it back out. So that's a pretty exciting prospect. Any last sort of like parting words or thoughts that you want to share with folks that are maybe interested in this?
Yeah, just my call to action to folks is look into open source AI. I think challenge yourself a little bit on what you're actually giving up to a lot of these centralized providers. I don't think you need to give them up cold turkey, like, but I think it's just good to be aware as a consumer, what you're actually giving up in these systems, and how to slowly perhaps build a system around your workflows and your life that don't just kind of jeopardize your sovereignty.
Nice. Yeah. Good. Well put. I think it's worth it. And this is one of those situations like the decentralized web and everything, that we kind of need to lock things open now before we wait and kind of look back and go like, oh shoot, I can't even do my job if I don't pay my,
Hmm.
whomever bill. So now's the time to think pretty seriously about this.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Matt. It's been a
Appreciate your
pleasure.
time, man. Yeah, thanks
We
for having me.
definitely should nerd out a little bit more about some of this stuff, and yeah, let's keep the